The sun was a hammer, and the high desert was the anvil upon which Clara Vance was being slowly, methodically broken. It had been 3 days since she had slipped away from the wagon train, cutting the tether of the only horse she could saddle without waking the guard. 3 days of riding through a landscape that looked like the devil's own backyard. Red rock spires that clawed at a bleaching blue sky. Scrub brush that snagged on her skirts, and silence so profound it felt like a physical weight pressing against her eardrums. Her horse, a roan mare with a white blaze, was failing. The animal's head hung low, stumbling over shale and dried twisted roots. Clara knew she should get off and walk to spare the beast, but her own legs felt like hollow reeds. Her mouth was full of dust, a grit that coated her tongue and throat until swallowing became a conscious, painful labor. She looked back over her shoulder, squinting against the glare. There was nothing but heat shimmering off the hardpan, distorting the horizon into watery illusions. Yet, the fear remained, cold and coiled in her belly. She could still hear the voice of Elias Thorne, the man her uncle intended her to marry in Prescott. Elias, with his hands that felt like sandpaper and his breath that smelled of chewing tobacco and entitlement. "He will break you," her aunt had whispered, not as a warning, but as a statement of fact. It is a woman's lot to be broken. Clara gripped the pommel of the saddle. She would rather die in this God-forsaken wilderness than be broken in a featherbed in Prescott. But the wilderness seemed eager to oblige her preference. The heat stroke came on not with a bang, but with a creeping confusion. The horizon began to tilt. The cacti, standing like silent sentinels with their arms raised in surrender, seemed to be vibrating. Memories began to bleed into the present, uninvited and violent. Suddenly, she was not 22 years old, riding a dying horse. She was 18, standing in the doorway of her father's homestead in the Verde Valley. She heard the hoofbeats first. Then came the screams. "Apache!" her father had shouted, shoving a heavy dragoon pistol into her hands. "Hide! Clara!" She had hidden in the root cellar, peering through the cracks in the floorboards. She saw men with painted faces, their hair long and wild. She saw the brutality, the fire, the way they laughed as they cut her father down. But even then, in the terror of the dark, a strange detail had snagged in her mind, a detail she had buried for 4 years. One of the savages had cursed when he tripped over a plowshare. He had cursed in English, with a thick Missouri drawl. God damn it, he had snarled. Outlaws. White men painted in red clay and charcoal to shift the blame, to stoke the fires of war so they could scavenge the ashes. The memory swirled, mixing with the blinding sun. Clara swayed. The roan mare stumbled hard, her front knees buckling. Clara did not have the strength to kick her feet from the stirrups. She went down with the animal, the ground rushing up to meet her with a jarring impact that knocked the breath from her lungs. She lay in the dirt, the scent of crushed sagebrush filling her nose. The mare groaned, a terrible, wet sound, and then went still. Clara tried to crawl, her fingers clawing at the dry earth. Her vision tunneled, the edges turning black. Missouri. She thought the word nonsensical in her fading mind. They were from Missouri. Then the blackness took her completely. Taza smelled death before he saw it. It was the smell of a horse pushed past its limit, a sour, metallic tang that cut through the dry heat. He stopped, crouching low beside a cluster of mesquite, his eyes scanning the arroyo below. He was Chiricahua, a Bedonkohe warrior who had ridden with Cochise, a man who knew the secrets of these stones better than he knew the lines of his own palm. He wore a faded calico shirt, stained with sweat and dust, and buckskin leggings that ended in moccasins folded down at the ankle. A red headband held back hair that was blacker than a raven's wing, though streaks of gray had begun to show at his temples, not from age, for he was only 35, but from grief. He saw the horse first, then the splash of blue fabric against the red dirt. A woman. Wide eyes. Taza remained motionless, his Winchester rifle resting easy in the crook of his arm. His first instinct was to turn away, let the desert take her. The white eyes had taken enough from him. They had taken the best hunting grounds. They had taken the water. They had taken his wife. Sani and his infant son. shot down by soldiers during a truce talk under a flag of peace. The memory was a coal that never stopped burning in his gut. But Taza was not just a warrior. He was a man who walked the spirit path of his mother, a woman known for her visions. And the wind shifting through the canyon whispered a strange unease to him. He moved silently down the slope, his steps making no sound on the loose scree. He approached the fallen horse. Dead. He looked at the woman. She was small, pale as the moon, her hair a tangled mass of light brown spilling out of a bonnet that had been crushed in the fall. He nudged her boot with the toe of his moccasin. She did not stir. He knelt, his hand hovering over her neck to feel for a pulse. Her skin was burning, dry as parchment. Heat sickness. If left here, she would be dead before sundown. The coyotes would scatter her bones, and the ants would take the rest. Let her die, the warrior in him hissed. She is one of them, the mother of your enemies. He looked at her face. It was not the face of a soldier. It was etched with pain, even in sleep. There were tear tracks cutting through the dust on her cheeks. With a grunt of annoyance at his own weakness, Taza slung his rifle across his back. He slid his arms under her. She weighed little more than a bundle of dry sticks, and lifted her. Her head lolled against his shoulder. She smelled of fear and lavender soap, a scent so alien in this place that it made him wrinkle his nose. He could not take her to the stronghold. The others would kill her, or worse. Jolan, who sought to lead the band, would use her as a bargaining chip or a target for his rage. There was a place, half a day's ride up the hidden trails, a split in the canyon wall where the old ones used to hide during the starving times, a cave with a seep of spring water. He whistled low, and his paint stallion, waiting obediently in the shade of a cottonwood, trotted forward. Taza mounted, pulling the woman up in front of him. She was a dead weight against his chest. He spurred the horse, turning away from the easy trail, climbing toward the jagged peaks that frowned down upon the valley. The world returned in fragments of pain and shadow. Clara opened her eyes, but there was no sky, only jagged rock stretching above her like the inside of a great skull. The light was dim, filtered through a curtain of hanging vines at the entrance of a cave. She tried to sit up, but a wave of nausea slammed her back down. Her head throbbed with a rhythm that matched her heartbeat. Still, a voice said, deep, resonant, like stones grinding together deep underground. Clara gasped, scrambling backward until her spine hit the cold rock wall. Her eyes adjusted to the gloom. A man sat across from her, tending a small fire of smokeless twigs. He was bare-chested now, his calico shirt hanging from a stick to dry. His skin was the color of bronze, mapped with scars. A long, jagged line running from his shoulder to his pectoral muscle, another marking his ribs. He looked as hard and unforgiving as the land itself. An Apache, terror, cold and absolute, flooded her veins. She looked around for a weapon, a rock, anything. The man turned his head slowly. His eyes were dark, obsidian pools that reflected the tiny flames. They were not angry eyes, but they were guarded, ancient. "Drink," he said. He held out a gourd. Clara stared at it, her breath coming in shallow, panicked hitches. What do you want?" Her voice was a wreck, cracked and dry. He did not answer. He merely pushed the gourd closer, his expression unreadable. "Water. Drink." The thirst overruled the terror. Clara reached out with a trembling hand. Snatching the gourd, she brought it to her lips and drank greedily. The water was cool, sweet, and tasted of moss. "Slow," he commanded. She lowered the gourd, coughing as the water hit her empty stomach. She wiped her mouth with the back of her hand. "Where am I? Who are you?" "You fall," he said, his English broken, the words heavy on his tongue. "The horse died. The sun takes you." He reached for a small pouch at his waist. Clara flinched, pressing harder against the stone wall. He paused, watching her reaction. A flicker of something passed over his face. Not amusement, but a weary understanding. He opened the pouch and pulled out a handful of crushed leaves. The smell was sharp, medicinal, He gestured to her ankle. Clara looked down. Her right boot had been removed. The ankle was swollen, purple and angry, the skin scraped raw from the fall. She hadn't even felt the pain until now, masked by the adrenaline. "Medicine," he said. "Fix." He moved toward her. Clara drew her leg back. "No, don't touch me." He stopped. He looked at her, his gaze shifting from her frightened eyes to the swollen joint. He did not force her. He simply sat back on his heels, waiting. The silence stretched between them, thick and heavy. Clara looked at her ankle. It throbbed mercilessly. She looked at the man. He could have killed her while she slept. He could have left her to the vultures. He had brought her here, given her water. Slowly, agonizingly. She extended her leg. Taza moved forward. His hands were large, calloused, roughened by war and work. Yet his touch was startlingly gentle. He applied the poultice to the bruise. The coolness was immediate, drawing the heat from the inflammation. He bound it with a strip of clean cloth. She realized with a jolt it was a strip torn from his own shirt. "Why?" she whispered. He did not look up. "Death is easy here. Life is hard." He tied the knot. "I am Taza. Clara." She breathed. He nodded once, accepting the name, then retreated to his side of the fire. The afternoon dragged on, the heat outside the cave baking the canyon walls until they radiated warmth like a brick oven. Inside, the air remained cool. They spoke little. The chasm of language and culture was too wide to bridge with simple chatter. Instead, they watched one another. Clara observed him through half-closed eyes, feigning sleep when his gaze turned her way. She saw the way he sat, perfectly still, conserving energy. She saw the scars. There was a burn mark on his forearm, old and shiny. There was a slash across his chest, but it was his face that held her attention. When he thought she was sleeping, the mask of the warrior slipped. His mouth turned down at the corners. He stared into the fire, not as a scout watching for danger, but as a man looking at ghosts. He was suffering. The realization startled her. She had been raised on stories of the Apache as bloodthirsty demons, incapable of human feeling. Yet here sat a man carved from sorrow. Taza watched her too. He saw the way her hands shook when she thought he wasn't looking. He saw the bruises on her wrists, faint, yellowish marks that were not from the fall. Someone had held her too hard. Someone had tried to keep her. She was a runaway, just like the ponies that broke their ropes to seek the high grass. He respected that. "You run," he said suddenly. It wasn't a question. Clara started. She pulled her knees to her chest. "Yes." "From a soldier? From a man who wanted to own me." Taza grunted. He understood ownership. The army treated the land like they owned it. They treated the people like cattle to be heralded onto reservations, counted and branded. "Man is bad," Taza said. "Like a wolf who eats its own leg." Clara blinked. Yes, exactly." A strange tension hummed in the air. Not the tension of fear, but of recognition. Two wounded animals circling each other in the dark, realizing they shared the same limp. As the afternoon wore on, the light at the cave mouth began to change. The relentless blue sky turned a bruised purple. The air grew heavy, charged with static. The silence of the desert was replaced by a low, distant rumble. "Rain," Taza said, standing up. He moved to the entrance, looking out. Big rain. The monsoon season in the high desert was violent and swift. Within minutes, the sky tore open. Lightning arced across the canyon, blindingly bright, followed by thunder that shook the very teeth in Clara's head. The wind howled, driving rain into the cave mouth. The temperature plummeted. The desert, so recently an oven, became an icebox. Clara shivered. Her dress was thin, torn in places, and damp from her own sweat, which was now turning cold. She wrapped her arms around herself, her teeth beginning to chatter. Taza turned from the storm. He saw her shaking. He looked at the dying fire. The wood he had gathered was nearly gone, and anything outside was now soaked. He hesitated. The laws of his people, the laws of her people, all of them forbade what necessity now dictated. But Taza had seen enough laws broken to know they offered no warmth. He moved to the back of the cave where he had laid out a rough blanket, a well-worn wool artifact, perhaps stolen from a cavalry supply or traded for years ago. He picked it up and walked to her. "Cold," he said. He sat down beside her, not touching, but close. He held out the blanket. Clara looked at the blanket, then at him. She was freezing. The cold seemed to be settling in the marrow of her bones, triggered by the shock of the last few days. "Thank you," she whispered. She took the blanket and wrapped it around her shoulders. It smelled of smoke and horse and him, an earthy musk scent that was not unpleasant, but the blanket was not enough. The shivering became violent, uncontrollable spasms. Her teeth clicked together loud enough to hear. Taza watched her for a moment longer. Then, with a sigh that sounded like the wind in the pines, he moved. "Come," he said. He shifted so his back was against the stone wall. He opened his arm, inviting her into the space beside him, to share the heat of his body. Clara froze. Every warning she had ever heard screamed in her mind. Savage, heathen, killer. But when she looked at him, she didn't see a killer. She saw the man who had cooled her ankle. She saw the man who had carried her. She moved. It was awkward at first. She sat stiffly beside him, the blanket draped over both of them. But as the thunder cracked again, a deafening boom that felt like the mountain cracking apart, she flinched, burying her face in her hands. Taza's arm came around her. It was heavy, solid. He pulled her closer, until her side was pressed against his chest. "Breath," he murmured. "Storm passes." Clara squeezed her eyes shut. The warmth radiating from him was incredible. It was a furnace against the chill of the storm. Slowly, her shivering began to subside. She rested her head tentatively against his shoulder. He did not push her away. His skin was warm against her cheek. She could feel the slow, steady thrum of his heart beneath his ribs. It was the most terrifyingly intimate moment of her life. She was pressed against a man who could snap her neck with one hand, a man her world called a monster. Yet she felt safer in this circle of firelight and shadow than she had felt in her uncle's parlor. Taza stared straight ahead, his jaw set. He could feel every curve of her, the softness of her, the trembling bird-like fragility of her frame. It had been 3 years since he had held a woman. 3 years since Sani. The scent of her lavender soap rose up, mixing with the ozone of the storm. It made his head spin. He forced himself to breathe shallowly. Clara shifted, seeking more warmth. Her hand, hidden beneath the blanket, brushed against his bare stomach. Taza's breath hitched, his muscles seized, hard as iron. Clara froze. "I'm sorry," she whispered into his skin. "No," he grated out. "Is good." The storm raged outside, tearing at the world, washing away the dust and the blood of the day. But inside the small pocket of the cave, the world had shrunk to the size of 2 heartbeats. Clara fell asleep like that, exhausted, her hand resting on his stomach, her head on his shoulder. Taza did not sleep. He sat vigil, listening to the rain, fighting a battle far harder than any raid. He fought the urge to bury his face in her hair. He fought the urge to run his hand down the curve of her spine. He fought the loneliness that howled louder than the wind. Dawn broke with a silence that rang in the ears. The storm had passed, leaving the air scrubbed clean and smelling of wet sage and damp earth. The light creeping into the cave was gray and soft. Clara woke slowly. She was warm, for the first time in days. She was not afraid. She realized her position. She was practically draped across Taza's lap. Her head was on his chest. Her hand was resting directly over his heart. She could feel the beat. Thump, 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 thump. Strong, steady, alive. She froze, waiting for him to shove her away, to reprimand her for her boldness. Slowly, she lifted her eyes. Taza was awake. He was looking down at her. His face was inches from hers. In the morning light, the harsh lines of his face seemed softer. His eyes were not the obsidian stones of the day before. They were deep, dark brown, filled with a complexity she couldn't name. He did not pull away. He did not move. He simply let her hand rest there, over the center of his life. For a long moment, nobody breathed. The connection between them was a physical thing, a taut wire humming with electricity. The accidental touches of the night had forged something in the dark, something that the light of day could not erase. Clara's fingers curled slightly against his skin. Taza's gaze dropped to her hand, then back to her eyes. "Morning," he whispered, the word a vibration against her cheek. "Morning," Clara replied, her voice trembling. She did not move her hand, and Taza, the war chief who had sworn to drive the White Eyes from his land, did not ask her to. He sat there, imprisoned by a touch lighter than a feather, and for the first time in 3 years, the coal of grief in his gut was not the only fire burning. The silence of the morning was not the peace Clara had imagined. It was a held breath, a suspension of time that shattered the moment Taza stood abruptly, his body going rigid as a drawn bowstring. He was at the mouth of the cave in 2 strides, his hand shielding his eyes against the glare of the rising sun. Clara sat up, pulling the blanket tighter around her shoulders, the ghost of his heartbeat still echoing against her palm. She watched him scan the valley floor far below, his stillness absolute. "What is it?" she asked, her voice small in the vast stone chamber. Taza did not answer immediately. He turned his head slightly, listening to the wind, reading the air in a way she could not comprehend. Then he pointed. Clara scrambled to her knees and crawled to the opening, careful to stay in the shadows as he did. She squinted, miles down, where the red earth flattened out into a plain of sage and alkali. A thin ribbon of dust was rising. It was too organized to be a dust devil. "Bluecoats," Taza said. The word was a curse, spat out like a bitter seed. Clara felt a jolt of cold fear, but it was followed by a confusing, heavy weight in her stomach. Soldiers, cavalry, men who looked like her father, men who spoke her language, men who would claim to be her rescuers. By all rights, she should have been scrambling down the screen, waving her petticoats, screaming for salvation. Instead, she looked at Taza's back, the broad expanse of muscle, the scars that mapped his history of violence and survival, and she felt a terrifying urge to remain hidden. The soldiers meant Prescott. They meant Elias Thorne and the cage of a marriage she would rather die than enter. They meant a return to a world that viewed her as property. Taza turned to her. His eyes were hard again, the tenderness of the dawn locked away behind the warrior's mask. "We go," he said. "High place, where horses cannot follow easily." "Will they see us?" Clara asked. "If we stay." "Yes, if we move." "Maybe not." He moved with frantic efficiency, kicking dirt over the remains of their small fire, scattering the ashes so they looked like old drift. He grabbed his rifle and the waterskin. "Can you walk?" Clara looked at her ankle. It throbbed, a dull, persistent ache, but the swelling had gone down thanks to his poultice. She stood, testing her weight. It hurt, a sharp bite of pain, but it was bearable. "I can walk." He nodded, not offering sympathy, only acknowledgement of her utility. He led the way out of the cave, moving not down toward the valley, but up, climbing a narrow, twisting goat trail that cut into the face of the crimson cliffs. The heat returned with a vengeance as the sun climbed the sky. It beat down on Clara's bonnetless head, burning her nose and the tops of her ears. The air grew thin as they ascended. Taza moved with the relentless pace of a wolf on the scent, though he stopped frequently, waiting for her to limp up behind him, his eyes constantly scanning their back trail. By midday, the soldiers were gone from sight, swallowed by the distance. But Taza did not relax. They were deep in the Dragoon Mountains now, a fortress of granite boulders balanced precariously on one another, creating a labyrinth of shadows and stone. They stopped to rest in the shade of a massive overhang. Clara collapsed against the cool rock, her breath coming in ragged gasps. Taza offered her the water gourd first. She drank, then handed it back. He took only a sip, conserving every drop. "Why do you run?" Clara asked suddenly. The question had been gnawing at her for hours. They are looking for you? Taza looked at her, wiping his mouth with the back of his hand. Always looking? Apache is wolf to them. Shoot on sight. But you are a scout, she said, remembering the blue wool jacket she had seen tied to his saddle before the horse died. I saw the coat. Taza's expression darkened. He looked away, staring at a hawk circling in the updraft. Was a scout, he corrected. For Crook, General Crook. He talked straight, but Crook went away. New men come. They want Apache in a cage. San Carlos. He spat on the ground. Hell's 40 acres. No grass. No water. People die. Clara watched him. So you left? I leave. I fight. And my family? The question hung between them, dangerous and sharp. The ones who killed them, were they fighting too? Taza turned his gaze on her, intense and piercing. Not Apache, he said firmly. I tell you, white men, bad men, paint faces. How do you know? I track them, Taza said. Iron shoes on horses. Apache ride unshod. They wear boots. Apache wears a moccasin. They leave tobacco tin, whiskey bottle. He shook his head. Make war between us. So the army came. Kill Apache. Take land. Clara felt the truth of it settle in her bones. It aligned with the memory of the curse words she had heard in the cellar. God damn it. She felt a wave of nausea, not from the heat, but from the betrayal of her own kind. Outlaws murdering settlers to stir up a war, profiting from the slaughter while men like Taza were hunted like animals. I believe you, she whispered. Taza looked at her, surprised. He seemed to search her face for deception, but found none. He gave a sharp nod, then stood. Come, not far now. They walked for another hour until the trail leveled out into a small, hidden plateau tucked between three towering peaks. It was a sanctuary of silence. In the center of the clearing stood a pile of stones, a cairn, carefully stacked, bleached white by years of sun. Taza stopped. His posture changed. The tension left his shoulders, replaced by a heavy, crushing sorrow. He walked to the cairn slowly, as a man walked into a church. Clara stayed back, sensing she was intruding on holy ground. She watched as Taza knelt. He placed his hand on the topmost stone. He did not pray aloud, but his lips moved, shaping words she could not hear. He reached into his pouch and pulled out a pinch of yellow pollen. He scattered it over the stones to the four directions, east, south, west, north. After a long time, he stood and turned to her. His face was stripped bare. My wife, he said, his voice rough. Sani. And son. Little boy. Clara's hand flew to her mouth. Here? He shook his head. No, down there. He pointed vaguely toward the distant forts. Soldiers say, come talk peace. Bring white flag. Sani go. She wants peace for the baby. Many women go, old men. He paused, his jaw working, the muscles bunching as he fought the memory. Soldiers give food, he continued, his English fracturing under the weight of the emotion. Give me a blanket. Then, signal. Guns hide in wagons. Big guns. Cannons. Clara closed her eyes, horror washing over her. Shoot everyone, Taza said flatly. Sani ran, baby on back. A soldier shot her. Threw back. Both die. He looked at the stones. I bring bodies here. High place, where wind blows free. No soldier steps here. Clara walked toward him. She did not think. She simply moved. She stopped a few feet away. The distance between them, settler and savage, white and copper, seemed to vanish, leaving only two parents who had lost, two children who had been hurt. I am so sorry, she said. The words felt inadequate. Useless things against such grief. Taza looked at her. For a moment, she thought he might push her away, might lash out at her as a symbol of the people who had butchered his family. But he didn't. He looked at her with a terrible, weary recognition. You lost your father, he said. Mother? My mother died giving me life. Clara said softly. My father died in the raid. I have no one. No, Taza said. You have ghosts, like me. He turned back to the stones. touching them one last time. Then he turned away, the mask sliding back into place, though it fit less securely than before. "The sun goes down. I need water." He led her down a fissure in the rock, a hidden cleft that opened into a tiny, lush grotto. It was a miracle in the desert. A spring bubbled up from the deep earth, filling a basin of smooth gray stone before disappearing back underground. Ferns grew in the cracks, brilliant green against the red rock. "Water," Taza said. "Drink. Wash." Clara looked at the pool. It was clear as glass. She was coated in 3 days of sweat, dust, and dried blood. She felt filthy, her skin itching and tight. She looked at Taza. He understood. He turned his back to her, walking to the entrance of the cleft. He sat down on a flat rock, facing outward, his rifle across his knees. "I watch," he said. "No, look." Clara hesitated. The vulnerability was immense. To strip naked in the wilderness, with an Apache warrior 10 yards away, but the water called to her. She unbuttoned her dress with shaking fingers. She stepped out of her layers, the torn petticoats, the corset that had felt like a cage, the chemise. The air was cool against her skin. She stepped into the water. It was shockingly cold, stealing the breath from her lungs. She submerged herself, scrubbing the grit from her arms, her face, her neck. She untied her hair, letting it float around her like a halo of seaweed. For the first time in days, she felt clean. She felt like herself, not a refugee, not a victim. She floated on her back, looking up at the sliver of blue sky between the canyon walls. Taza sat like a statue. He did not turn, but he was aware of every splash, every ripple. The sound of the water shifting around her body was a torture and a comfort. He closed his eyes, listening. He imagined the coolness of the water on her skin. He imagined the whiteness of her in the dark water. He forced his mind to the horizon, to the threats that might be coming, but his heart remained in the grotto, beating a heavy, treacherous rhythm. Clara finished. She dressed quickly. Though her clothes were still dusty, she wrung out her hair. "I'm done," she called softly. Taza stood and turned. He avoided looking directly at her at first, but then his eyes caught hers. She looked fresh, renewed. Her hair was damp and dark, curling around her face. She looked less like a ghost and more like a woman. "Good," he said, his voice tight. Night fell over the mountains, a blanket of indigo pierced by 1,000,000,000 stars. The air grew cold, the biting chill of the high desert that could freeze a man to death in midsummer. They made camp in a shallow depression near the spring, sheltered from the wind. Taza risked a small fire, digging a deep hole so the flames remained hidden below ground level, casting a warm, ruddy glow upward onto their faces. They ate the last of Taza's dried meat, jerky that was tough as leather but savory. They sat close to the fire, their shoulders almost touching. The silence tonight was different. It was not the wary silence of the first meeting, nor the grief-stricken silence of the cairn. It was a companionable silence, woven with a thread of anticipation that pulled tight between them. Clara watched the firelight dance on Taza's profile. He was beautiful, she realized with a start. Not in the way Elias Thorne was considered handsome, with his soft hands and groomed mustache. Taza was beautiful like a thunderstorm, like a cliff face, harsh, dangerous, and breathtaking. "What will you do?" she asked softly. "Where will you go?" Taza stared into the embers. "Mexico, Sierra Madre. Old ones are there. Geronimo is there. Maybe find peace." "Take me with you," Clara said. The words were out before she could think them through. Taza turned his head slowly, staring at her. "No," he said. "Apache life is hard. Hunger, cold, running. You are soft flower. You die." "I am not a flower," Clara said, a flash of anger in her eyes. "I survived the raid. I survived the desert. I survived the silence of my uncle's house, which was worse than the hunger. I am not soft." "Taza." He looked at her, really looked at her. He saw the set of her jaw, the fire in her green eyes. He saw the woman who had placed her hand over his heart and not pulled away. "No," he admitted softly. "Not soft. Strong. like willow, bend, not break. He reached out, his hand hovering near her face. He traced the line of her jaw with one calloused finger. His touch was electric. Clara stopped breathing. "Why are you not afraid?" he murmured. "I am the enemy." "You saved me," Clara whispered. She turned her face into his hand, pressing her cheek against his palm. "You are the only one who ever saved me." She reached up and took his hand, interlacing her fingers with his. Her skin was pale against his bronze, her fingers slender against his scarred knuckles, a contrast that should not exist, yet fit perfectly. Taza trembled. The control he had forged over a lifetime of war began to crack. He looked at her lips. They parted slightly, trembling. He leaned in. It was a slow movement, giving her 1,000 chances to pull away, to scream, to run. She did not run. She leaned toward him. His lips brushed hers. It was tentative, a question asked in the dark. His mouth was warm, tasting of smoke. He kissed her with a reverence that made her heart ache, softly, gently, as if she were made of glass and he was terrified of shattering her. Clara let out a soft sound, a sigh of release. At the sound, Taza pulled back abruptly. He scrambled backward a few inches, his chest heaving. He looked at her with wide, panicked eyes. He looked at his hands as if they were covered in blood. "No," he rasped. "Cannot. You are. I am." He was ashamed. He was a chief, a leader of men, and he was about to take the woman of the enemy. A woman he was sworn to protect, not defile. He saw himself through the eyes of the reservation agents, and saw himself as the savage they claimed he was. Clara saw the shame. It broke her heart more than his rejection. She moved. She crawled across the small space between them. She reached out, taking his face in both her hands, forcing him to look at her. "Taza," she whispered. "Look at me." He refused. His eyes squeezed shut. "Look at me," she commanded, her voice fierce. He opened his eyes. They were wet. "I am not them," she said. "And you are not a savage. You are a man. You are the man I choose." She brushed her thumb over his cheekbone. "Don't stop," she whispered. "Please, do not leave me alone in the cold." The wall broke. Taza let out a groan, a sound of surrender. He reached for her, burying his hands in her hair, pulling her to him. This time, the kiss was not gentle. It was desperate. It was the collision of two starving souls finding sustenance. He kissed her with the hunger of a man who had not eaten in years, and she met him with equal force, her hands clutching at his shoulders, pulling him closer, closer. He lowered her back onto the blanket. The ground was hard beneath them, the fire casting long, dancing shadows against the canyon walls. He moved over her, his weight heavy and grounding. He paused, hovering above her, his eyes searching hers for any sign of fear. All he found was welcome. He undressed her slowly, his hands shaking. He treated every inch of her skin as if it were sacred territory, mapping her with his touch. When his skin met hers, bare against bare, a shock went through them both. The contrast of his heat and her coolness, his roughness and her softness. They made love with an aching intensity. It was slow, unhurried. There was no rush to finish, only a desperate need to feel. Taza moved with a restraint that cost him everything, terrifyingly afraid of hurting her. But Clara arched into him, urging him on, showing him that she was not breakable, that she could hold him. Every touch was a reclamation. With every stroke, they erased the names the world had given them: widow, savage, runaway, killer, until there was only the man and the woman, breathing the same air under the same indifferent stars. It was a testing, a silent question asked in the rhythm of their bodies. Can tenderness survive in a world this cruel? Yes. Yes, it could. When it was over, the silence returned. But it was changed. It was heavy now, filled with the weight of what they had done. They had crossed a line from which there was no return. Taza rolled away from her, lying on his back, staring up at the slice of sky. He pulled the blanket over them, covering her carefully, but he did not touch her. He spoke into the darkness, a string of guttural, flowing words in his own tongue. It sounded like a confession, or perhaps a prayer for forgiveness from the ghosts he had left at the cairn. Clara lay still, her body humming, her heart full to bursting. She heard the sorrow in his voice. She knew he was drifting away, pulling back into the fortress of his guilt. She would not let him go. She reached out in the dark, finding his hand where it lay clenched at his side. She pried his fingers open, weaving hers through them once more. She squeezed tight, an anchor in the storm. "You're not alone anymore," she whispered into the dark. Taza did not answer, but slowly, hesitantly. His fingers curled around hers, and he did not let go. The morning sun did not bring the same soft grace as the dawn before. It brought a harsh, exposing light that made the shadows of the canyon look sharp and dangerous. Taza moved with a grim purpose, kicking dirt over their small fire and erasing their tracks with a branch of creosote bush. Clara watched him, wrapping her torn shawl around her shoulders. The tenderness of the night before had not vanished, but it had been armored over by necessity. Taza was no longer just the man who had held her. He was the scout, the warrior, the man who knew that every hour they lingered was a gamble with death. "We go," he said, handing her the waterskin. Long ride, hard ride. They had no horse. The climb out of the dragoons was a brutal test of endurance. Taza led them up deer trails that were little more than scratches on the granite face, moving higher into the timberline where the air was thin and smelled of pine resin. Clara followed, her ankle throbbing with a dull, insistent rhythm, but she did not complain. She had learned quickly that complaint was a luxury of the parlor, not a tool of the wilderness. Taza was taking her to the deep stronghold, a place known only to the Bedonkohe band, tucked away in the jagged spine of the mountains. He had told her of Nali, an elderly woman, a grandmother to half the tribe, who might possess enough authority to shield them, or at least enough pity not to kill Clara on sight. By late afternoon, the terrain leveled out into a high alpine meadow. The peace of the wind moving through the grass was shattered by the sudden drum of hoofbeats. Taza froze, his hand flying to the stock of his Winchester. He pushed Clara behind a cluster of boulders, his body becoming a shield. "Stay low," he hissed. 3 riders burst from the tree line. They were Apache, stripped for war, their bodies painted with clay, red headbands tying back their harsh black hair. They rode without saddles, their knees gripping the ribs of their ponies. They pulled up short, dust swirling around the hooves of their mounts. The lead rider, a man with a scar bisecting his nose, leveled his rifle at Taza. "Taza!" the man shouted in Apache, the sound guttural and sharp. He looked from Taza to the woman crouching in the rocks. His eyes widened and then narrowed into slits of pure hate. "You bring the enemy to the high places?" Taza stepped out from the cover, his rifle held across his chest, barrel pointed low but ready to rise. He spoke in their tongue, but Clara, watching from the cracks in the stone, understood the tone. It was defiant. The lead rider spat on the ground. He switched to a rough, heavily accented English, perhaps for Clara's benefit, or perhaps to show his disdain for Taza's time as a scout for the army. "You are a dog who eats from the white hand," the rider sneered. "Now you bring a white whore to our fire?" Taza did not flinch. "She is under my protection. Chaitin, she is not a soldier. She is running from them, as we are." "She is a beacon!" Chaitin shouted, his horse dancing nervously beneath him. "The bluecoats will follow her scent. You endanger the people for this, pale ghost?" The other 2 riders unslung their weapons. Clara felt her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. She saw Taza's muscles coil. He was 1 man against 3. "Touch her," Taza said, his voice dropping to a terrifyingly quiet register. "And I will leave your bodies for the buzzards before the sun touches the peaks." The threat hung in the air, heavy and absolute. Taza's reputation was not a myth. These men knew him. They knew he had ridden with Cochise. They knew he had killed more men than they had horses. Chayton stared at him, weighing the cost of violence. Slowly, he lowered his rifle. You are sick in the head. Taza, the spirits have twisted you. If you bring her to the camp, it is Jolan you must answer to. He will not be as patient. Let Jolan speak for himself, Taza replied. Chayton gathered his reins, casting one last look of loathing at Clara. The earth will drink your blood for this betrayal. He kicked his pony, and the three riders thundered past, vanishing into the trees. Taza stood still until the sound of their passage faded entirely. When he turned back to Clara, his face was pale beneath the bronze skin. They will tell the others, Clara said, her voice trembling. Yes, Taza said. He reached out, pulling her up from the rocks. We must move fast, before fear turns to anger. The camp was hidden in a box canyon, accessible only by a narrow defile that could be defended by a single rifleman. As they walked through the gap, the smell hit Clara first, roasting agave hearts, wood smoke, and the curing of hides. It was a small band, perhaps 40 souls, living in brush wickiups that blended seamlessly with the landscape. As Taza and Clara entered the clearing, the activity stopped. Children who had been playing with sticks froze. Women scraping deer hides laid down their tools. The silence was absolute and crushing. Every eye was on Clara. She felt the weight of their hatred, a physical pressure against her skin. She kept her head down, following Taza's heels, conscious of her torn dress, her pale skin, the very fact of her existence which was an affront to these people. Taza walked straight to a wickiup set apart from the others, built against the canyon wall. An old woman sat outside, weaving a basket from willow strips. Her hair was entirely white, her face a map of wrinkles so deep they looked like river canyons. She did not look up as they approached. Nali, Taza said softly. The old woman stopped weaving. She raised her head. Her eyes were milky with age, but they held a piercing intelligence. She looked at Taza, then slowly shifted her gaze to Clara. She did not blink. She spoke in Apache, her voice a dry rattle. It sounded like a scolding. Taza bowed his head slightly, accepting the words. He replied, gesturing to Clara, then to the mountains, then to his heart. Nali let out a sharp cackle that sounded devoid of humor. She stood up, surprisingly tall for her age, and walked over to Clara. She reached out a hand that felt like a bundle of dried twigs and grabbed Clara's chin. Forcing her head up, Clara flinched but did not pull away. Nali turned Clara's face side to side, inspecting her like a horse at an auction. She touched the bruise on Clara's cheek where the branch had struck her days ago. Then she looked into Clara's eyes. Whatever she saw there made her pause. The grip on Clara's chin softened. Nali turned to Taza and spoke in English, her voice thick and rasping. You bring trouble, grandson, big trouble. She has nowhere to go, Taza said. She has people, Nali snapped. Let them take her. They will kill her, Taza said. Or worse. Nali looked back at Clara. She sniffed the air near Clara's shoulder. She smells of fear. And you? She narrowed her eyes at Taza. You have lied to her. It was not a question. Clara felt the heat rise in her cheeks, burning bright red. Nali shook her head, spitting on the ground. Foolish. A warrior's heart is not a toy. She sighed, a long, rattling sound. But she is here. To turn her out now is to give her to the wolves. She stays in my lodge, hidden. But Taza, she pointed a crooked finger at his chest. Jolan watches. The wolves are not only outside the canyon. Life in the camp was a lesson in isolation. Clara was allowed to stay in Nali's wickiup, sleeping on a pile of furs that smelled of ancient smoke. During the day, Taza was gone, called away to councils with the men, or patrolling the perimeter. Clara was left with the women. She tried to make herself useful. She could not bear to be the idle burden they thought her to be. On the second morning, she sat near the fire where 3 women were grinding corn into meal using heavy stone manos. Clara approached, kneeling beside them. She reached for a stone, the woman nearest her. a young mother with a baby strapped to a cradleboard. "Snatch the stone away," she said something sharp, her eyes flashing with disdain. The other women laughed, a cruel, hard sound. Clara sat back, stung, but she did not leave. She waited until they turned away. Then she picked up a fallen pestle and began to grind the mesquite beans in a discarded bowl. She worked silently, her movements awkward at first. She crushed her fingers. She made a mess. The woman ignored her, talking over her head as if she were a dog. But she kept working. By noon, her hands were blistered and bleeding, but she had a small pile of food. Nali came by, leaning on her stick. She looked at the meal, then at Clara's bleeding hands. She did not smile. She reached into her sash and pulled out a handful of dried leaves. She dropped them into Clara's lap. "For the hands," Nali grunted. "Do not bleed on the food. It makes it sour." It was a small mercy, but to Clara, it felt like a victory. That evening, Taza returned. He looked exhausted, his eyes shadowed. He sat with Clara and Nali by their small fire, eating the stew Clara had helped prepare. "Jolon speaks loudly," Taza said quietly, staring into the flames. "He says I have forgotten the blood of my wife. He says I sleep with the enemy while the enemy kills our children." Clara put down her bowl. "I should leave. Taza, I am tearing you apart from them." Taza looked at her, his expression fierce. "No, you are not the enemy. Jolon wants power. If you were not here, he would find another reason to challenge me." "But I'll make it easy for him," she whispered. Taza reached out, covering her hand with his. In the center of the hostile camp, the gesture was dangerously open. Let him talk. Words are wind. But the wind was picking up speed. 2 days later, the tension broke. Clara was gathering wood near the edge of the creek that ran through the back of the canyon. It was the only time she was allowed to wander slightly, provided she stayed within sight of the sentries. She was bending to pick up a piece of drift when she heard voices coming from a cluster of willows. "Rifles," a voice said. It was low, male, and speaking a rough mix of Spanish and English. Clara froze. She crept closer, hiding behind a large boulder. Through the leaves, she saw Jolon. He was a striking man, younger than Taza, with a cruel mouth and eyes that burned with ambition. He was speaking to a Mexican trader, a man with a greasy hat and a mule pack. "The soldiers at Fort Bowie," Jolon said, struggling with the language but making his meaning clear. "They want the woman, the white woman." The trader spat tobacco juice. "They put a price on her. Or on the chief." "Both," Jolon said. "But they want her alive. They say she killed an officer." Clara's hand flew to her mouth. The officer she had stabbed with her hairpin. She hadn't known if he was dead. "I give you the woman," Jolon said, his voice dropping. "You give me Winchester, 10 of them, and ammunition." The trader whistled. "That is a high price for one woman." "She is worth it to them," Jolon snarled. "And to me, she makes Taza weak. When she is gone, I lead—" "Bring her to the pass at the full moon," the trader said. "We make the trade." Clara waited until they moved away. Then she scrambled back toward the wickiups, her heart pounding so hard she thought it would burst. She found Taza sharpening his knife by Nali's fire. He saw her face, pale, terrified, and stood immediately. "Clara!" She grabbed his arm, pulling him into the shadows of the lodge. "They are going to sell me," she whispered, the words tumbling out. "Jolon! I heard him. He is trading me for rifles. To the soldiers!" Taza went perfectly still. The air around him seemed to drop in temperature. "You heard this?" "Yes, at the creek. He meets a trader at the full moon." Taza's grip on his knife tightened until his knuckles were white. He would sell a guest of the tribe. "He has no honor." "He wants you gone," Clara said, tears welling in her eyes. "He says I make you weak. Taza, he is right. I am a weakness. If I stay, he will kill you or betray you to get to me." "He will try," Taza said, his voice deadly calm. "No!" Clara grabbed his face, forcing him to look at her. "I won't let you die for me. Take me to the edge of the mountains. Leave me there. I will walk to the fort. I will turn myself in." "You will hang," Taza said. "Better I hang than you die." She sobbed. "Please, I cannot be the reason you lose your people." Taza looked at her. He saw the terror in her eyes, but beneath it, he saw a love so fierce it terrified him. She was willing to walk into a noose to save him. He dropped the knife. He wrapped his arms around her, crushing her to him. The need to hold her, to prove she was still there, overwhelmed the danger, the politics, the hate outside the tent. He kissed her, tasting the salt of her tears. It was not a gentle kiss. It was a claim, a defiance of everything that tried to separate them. They sank onto the furs. The sounds of the camp outside, the dogs, the voices, the wind faded away. There was only the desperate friction of skin, the frantic rhythm of their breath. They moved together with a frantic urgency, as if they could fuse their bodies into one entity that no soldier and no traitor could tear apart. Clara clung to his shoulders, her nails digging into his skin. "Let me go," she whispered against his neck, even as her legs wrapped around his waist, pulling him deeper. "Please, let me go." "Never," Taza groaned. He made love to her until they were both trembling, slick with sweat, the world reduced to the smell of sage and each other. Afterward, they lay tangled in the furs, the fire in the center of the lodge dying down to embers. Taza stroked Clara's hair, his hand large and heavy and comforting. "You must listen," he said, his voice rumbling in his chest. "I lost Zani because I tried to follow the rules of the white man. I tried to make peace. I followed the path they cut." He propped himself up on one elbow, looking down at her. His eyes were dark pools of resolve. "I do not follow paths anymore. I make them—" "Taza, there are too many of them," Clara whispered. "Jolon, the soldiers, the tribe." "I do not care," he said. He brushed a stray lock of hair from her forehead. "I was dead, Clara, walking dead. My heart was a stone in my chest. Then I will find you in the dirt." He leaned closer, his forehead resting against hers. "You walked into my life like a storm," he whispered, the English words rough but powerful. "You broke the stone. Now I would burn the earth to keep you. I would burn the sky." Clara looked at him, saw the absolute, terrifying truth in his eyes. He meant it. He would fight the entire world for her. "Then we will burn it together," she breathed. Taza kissed her forehead. "Rest. Tomorrow. The wolf comes. We must be ready to bite back." Outside the wickiup, the wind howled through the canyon, carrying the scent of rain and the distant, ominous cry of a coyote. The full moon was 3 days away. Time was running out. The drums began an hour before dawn. They were not the rhythmic, pounding drums of a war dance, but a slow, steady beat that sounded like a heart failing. Taza sat awake in the darkness of Nali's wickiup, his Winchester resting across his knees, beside him. Clara slept a restless, twitching sleep, her hand still gripping the edge of his buckskin shirt. Outside, the air was thick with smoke and the rising murmur of voices. Jolon was speaking. Taza could hear the cadence of the younger man's voice, sharp, rising and falling like a whip. He didn't need to hear the words to know what they were. Betrayal, weakness, the white witch. The flap of the wickiup was pushed aside. Nali entered, moving with a silent urgency that belied her age. She carried a small bundle of dried meat and a pouch of water. "The fire is lit," she rasped, her voice barely audible over the distant chanting. "Jolon has turned into a young man. They say you have brought a curse. They say the soldiers will come and burn the corn because she is here." Taza looked at the old woman. "And the elders? The elders are afraid," Nali said. "Fear makes men deaf to reason. You must go. Taza, now, before the sun hits the canyon wall." Taza nodded. He gently shook Clara's shoulder. She woke instantly, her eyes wide with the reflex of the hunted. "Is it time?" "Yes," Taza said. "They will watch the main trail," Nali whispered. pressing the food into Taza's hands. "Go the old way, the goat path behind the ridge. It is steep, but the horses cannot follow quickly." Taza stood, slinging the rifle over his shoulder. He looked at Nali, the woman who had been a grandmother to him when his own blood was gone. "If we go, I cannot come back. I am cut off." Nali reached out, touching his face with a hand like dry parchment. "You were cut off the day you looked at her and saw a spirit instead of an enemy. Go, live." They slipped out the back of the wickiup, moving like shadows against the canyon wall. The camp was focused on the central fire where Jolon stood, his chest painted with white clay, screaming to the sky. His fury provided the distraction they needed. Taza led Clara up the sheer rock face, finding handholds where none seemed to exist. They climbed in silence, the sounds of the inciting mob fading beneath the whistle of the wind. By the time the sun breached the horizon, painting the rocks in violent shades of orange and blood red, they were miles away, moving through a dense stand of ponderosa pine. But the silence of the mountains was a lie. Taza sensed it before he heard it, a shift in the air, a snap of a twig that was not caused by a deer. He spun, shoving Clara hard to the ground. "Down!" The air hissed. A darker shadow detached itself from the trees. An arrow struck the pine trunk exactly where Clara's head had been a second before, the shaft vibrating with the force of the impact. "Run!" Taza roared, raising his rifle. Clara scrambled up, her skirts catching on the underbrush. She ran blindly through the trees, her breath tearing at her throat. Behind her, the crack of Taza's Winchester shattered the morning. She didn't see the second archer. He rose from behind a fallen log, a painted ghost in the dappled light. He didn't have a gun, only a bow, drawn tight. Clara froze, her feet skidding on the pine needles. The arrow flew. She twisted, trying to dive, but she wasn't fast enough. A line of fire seared across her upper arm, just below the shoulder. The impact spun her around, and she hit the ground hard, the world exploding into white spots. Taza heard her cry out. He abandoned his cover, charging through the brush with a primal scream. He saw the archer, a man he knew. It was Bishko, a warrior Taza had once taught to track elk, a man who had eaten at his fire. Bishko was reaching for another arrow, his face a mask of grim determination. He saw Taza coming and dropped the bow, drawing his knife. Taza did not slow down. He slammed into Bishko, the force of the impact carrying them both into the dirt. They rolled, a tangle of limbs and steel. Bishko was younger, stronger, fueled by the righteousness of Jolon's lies. He slashed at Taza's face, the blade cutting a shallow line across Taza's cheek. Taza grunted, catching Bishko's wrist. He looked into the younger man's eyes. He saw no recognition there, only the blank stare of a man killing a stranger. "Bishko!" Taza gritted out. "Stop! Traitor!" Bishko spat, driving the knife down with all his weight. Taza had no choice. The knife was inches from his throat. He twisted his hips, bucking Bishko off balance, and drove his own blade upward, under the ribs, into the heart. Bishko gasped, his eyes widening in sudden shock. The fight went out of him instantly. He slumped heavily and died on top of Taza. Taza lay there for a second, the weight of his former brother crushing the breath from him. He pushed the body away and scrambled up, his hands slick with blood that was not his own. "Clara!" He found her curled at the base of a tree, clutching her arm. Blood was welling up between her fingers, dark and fast. The arrow had passed through the flesh, tearing a jagged furrow but missing the bone. "I'm all right," she gasped, her face the color of ash. "It's just a scratch." Taza looked at the wound. It was deep, and the arrow point had been dirty, but it was the blood on his hands that made him shake. He wiped them frantically on his leggings. "We cannot stay," he said, his voice rough. "Others will hear the shot." He pulled her up. She swayed, but she stood. Together, leaving the body of the Apache scout to the forest floor. They ran. They retreated into a narrow gorge, a slit in the earth where the sun rarely touched the bottom. The rock walls wept moisture, and the air smelled of wet stone and decay. It was a place of hiding, but not a place of life. By nightfall, Clara could no longer walk. The scratch had turned angry and hot. Her skin burned, and she shivered violently despite the heavy air of the gorge. Taza found a shallow overhang and laid her down on the damp sand. He built a small fire, shielding it with rocks so the light would not travel. When he looked at the wound, his heart hammered against his ribs. The flesh around the cut was purple and swollen. Poison, or just the rot of the earth entering the blood? "Water," Clara whispered. Her lips were cracked. Taza gave her the last of the skin. She drank and immediately retched, her body rejecting it. "Taza," she murmured, her eyes unfocused. "The wagon. Is the wagon ready?" The fever was taking her. Taza worked with desperate focus. He crushed sagebrush and a handful of yellow flowers he had snatched from the meadow during their flight. He mixed them with a little mud and water to make a poultice. "This will hurt," he said softly. He cleaned the wound with the rough spirits from a small flask he carried, trade whiskey he kept for wounds. "Not drinking." Clara screamed, a high, thin sound that echoed off the canyon walls. Taza pinned her arm with his knee, applying the poultice and binding it tight with a strip of cloth. The night deepened. Clara tossed and turned, trapped in the labyrinth of her own mind. In the fever dream, she was back in the homestead. The air smelled of iron and boiled linens. She was 5 years old, standing in the doorway of the bedroom. Her father, Amos Vance, was sitting by the bed, his head in his hands. On the bed lay a shape covered in a sheet. Amos turned to look at her. His eyes were red, rimmed with a grief that had curdled into resentment. "You did this," he said. His voice was not a shout, but a cold, flat statement. "She was fine until you were too big. You tore her apart coming out." Little Clara tried to back away, but the floorboards were sticky with blood. She couldn't move. "You took her life," Amos said, standing up. He towered over her. "You owe a debt. Girl, a life for a life. You don't get to be happy. You don't get to be free. You carry the burden." The scene shifted. She was in the wagon, heading to Prescott. Elias Thorne was there, smiling, his teeth yellow. "Broken things are cheaper," he said. "Your uncle told me. You are damaged goods, Clara, but I like breaking things." "No," Clara moaned in the gorge, thrashing against the stone. I didn't mean to. Taza pulled her into his lap. He wrapped his arms around her, holding her tight against his chest to stop her thrashing. She was burning up, her heat radiating through his clothes. "Shh," he whispered. "You are safe. You are with Taza. He blames me." She wept, tears leaking from her closed eyes. "I killed her. I killed my mother." Taza rocked her, the movement rhythmic and ancient. He felt her pain as if it were his own arrow wound. He knew this ghost. He lived with it every day. The ghost of failure. The ghost of being the one who survived when better people died. He began to sing. It was a low, chanting song, an Apache prayer for the sick. He called on the spirits of the mountain, the wind, the bear. He did not know if he believed them anymore. The spirits had been silent when Sani died, but he poured every ounce of his will into the words. He offered his own strength to the darkness. "Take me," he prayed in his mind. "Take my breath. Give it to her." "Usin," he whispered, invoking the Creator, Life-giver. "Do not take this one. She is the only light left in the world. Do not put out the fire." He held her through the darkest hour of the night, wiping the sweat from her brow, whispering to her in Apache and broken English, fighting the death angel with nothing but his hands and his voice. The fever broke just as the first gray light of dawn filtered into the gorge. Clara's breathing shifted. The jagged, shallow gasps smoothed out into a deep, rhythmic slumber. Her skin, which had been dry and burning, broke into a cool sweat. Taza slumped against the rock wall, exhausted to his very marrow. He looked down at her. She was pale, her face drawn and gaunt, but the peace had returned to her features. She slept for hours. Taza did not move, afraid to wake her, afraid to break the spell of survival. When she finally opened her eyes, the sun was high enough to send a shaft of light down to the canyon floor. She blinked, looking up at him. Her eyes were clear. The green was bright again, the haze of the fever gone. "Taza," she croaked. He brought the water skin to her lips. She drank, and this time, she kept it down. She looked around the gorge, then at the bandage on her arm, then finally back to his face. She saw the exhaustion etched into his lines, the shadow of the beard on his jaw, the way his eyes watched her with a terrified hope. She reached up with her good hand, touching his cheek. "You stayed." "I said I would burn the earth," Taza said quietly. "I fought the ghosts for you." Clara remembered the dream, the weight of her father's accusation, and she remembered the voice that had pulled her out of it, a deep, rumbling baritone that had promised safety, that had told her she was not a debt to be paid, but a fire to be cherished. "My father," she whispered, the tears coming soft and slow. "He always told me I was dead, that I was the reason my mother died. I believed him. I thought I deserved the pain, that I deserved Elias." Taza covered her hand with his. "A child is life. Death is death. They are not the same. Your father spoke with a poisoned tongue." Clara looked at him, her soul laid bare. "I heard you singing. In the dark. You called me light." Taza looked away, bashful for a moment. "You are—" She pulled his face down to hers. She kissed him, tasting the salt and the dust and the sheer, impossible miracle of being alive. "You gave me back to myself," she whispered against his lips. "I am not his sin anymore. I am yours." Taza buried his face in her neck, breathing her in. "And I am yours. No tribe, no chief, just us." They moved on 2 days later. When Clara was strong enough to walk, they traveled south, away from the Apache strongholds and away from the army patrols, into the borderlands where the map was just a suggestion. They found the mission by accident. It sat in a valley of yellow grass, a crumbling skeleton of adobe bricks and Spanish ambitions. The roof of the sanctuary had long since collapsed, open to the sky, but the bell tower still stood, defiant against the wind. It was abandoned, likely deserted 50 years ago during the first major raids. But the walls offered shade, and a well in the courtyard still held water, brackish, but sweet enough when boiled. They made a camp in the sacristy, the only room with a partial roof. For a week, the world left them alone. They lived a life of stolen moments. Taza hunted jackrabbits and quail. Clara gathered wood and mended their clothes. In the evenings, they sat on the crumbling wall of the courtyard, watching the sun set over the purple hills. It was here, in the ruins of a dead religion, that they began to build a new one. "We could go to Mexico," Taza said one evening, whittling a piece of ironwood. "Deep south, build a house, a cabin," Clara said, smiling, "with a window facing the water." "Water," Taza scoffed gently. "You want a lake? In the desert?" "I can dream," she laughed. The sound of her laughter was startling. It bounced off the adobe walls, light and musical. Taza looked at her, stunned. He realized he had never heard her laugh. It was a beautiful sound. He started to chuckle, a rusty, deep sound that rumbled in his chest. "A lake," he said, shaking his head. "Okay, we found a lake. And horses, spotted ponies. And children," Clara said softly, watching him. Taza stopped whittling. He looked at the knife in his hand, then at her. The grief of Sani and his son was still there, a stone in his pocket, but it was no longer a boulder crushing his chest. He imagined a child with Clara's green eyes and his dark skin, a child who would not know war. "Yes," he said, his voice thick. "Children. Who runs free." Clara leaned her head on his shoulder. "It sounds like a good life. Taza, it is a dream," he warned, but his arm went around her. "Dreams are all we have," she said. "Let's keep this one." But the desert has eyes, and peace is a fragile thing in a land at war. 3 days later, Clara was washing Taza's shirt at the well. Taza was out checking snares for rabbits. The sun was warm, and Clara was humming a tune she hadn't thought of in years, a lullaby her aunt used to sing. She didn't hear the mule until it was close. She spun around, water dripping from the shirt. An old man was sitting on a mule at the break in the courtyard wall. He was grizzled, wearing a battered hat and clothes that were more patched than fabric. He looked like a prospector, one of the desert rats who spent their lives chasing the color of gold. Clara froze. Her pistol was in the sacristy. The old man squinted at her. He chewed slowly on a piece of tobacco. "Howdy, ma'am," he said. His voice was scratchy. Harmless. "Good day," Clara said, trying to keep her voice steady. "We have no water to spare." The old man laughed, a wheezing sound. "I got water, just passing through. Didn't know the old mission had ghosts." He rode a few steps closer. His eyes, watery and blue, swept over her. He lingered on her face. A flicker of recognition sparked in his gaze, brief, instantly hidden. But Clara saw it. She had seen the posters too. Runaway, reward, kidnapped by hostiles. "Are you out here alone?" the man asked, too casually. "My husband is near—" Clara lied, standing tall. "He is a heavy sleeper, but a light shooter." The old man chuckled again, backing his mule up. "No offense intended. Mrs., just admiring the view. I'll be moving on." He tipped his hat and turned the mule, riding away at a slow, ambling pace. Clara watched him go until he disappeared over the ridge. Panic, cold and sharp, pierced her chest. He had recognized her. She was sure of it. The reward for her return, or the capture of the renegade who took her, was $500, a fortune to a man like that. Taza returned 10 minutes later, carrying 2 rabbits. He saw her face and dropped the game immediately. "What?" "A man," Clara said, grabbing his arm. "An old prospector. He saw me. He knew me. Taza." "I saw it in his eyes." Taza looked at the ridge. "How long?" "Just now. He rode south." Taza cursed, a harsh Apache word. "South is Fort Huachuca. If he rides hard, he is there by sunset." "He will bring them," Clara said, her voice rising. "He will bring the cavalry." Taza grabbed the rabbits and his rifle. The dream of the cabin and the lake evaporated like mist. The reality of the hunt was back. "We run," Taza said, his eyes hard. "Tonight, we run until the horses die." But even as they packed their meager belongings, Taza knew. The old man wouldn't just ride to the fort. He would ride to the telegraph station. The wires would sing. The net was closing. And the world that would not forgive them was coming with iron hooves. The dawn did not arrive with the soft, promising light of the previous days. It came as a gray, suffocating shroud, heavy with the scent of impending heat and the metallic tang of ozone. Taza was awake before the light touched the tops of the crumbling mission walls. He had slept fitfully, his hand wrapped around the stock of his rifle, his dreams plagued by the image of the old prospector's watery blue eyes. He knew, with the instinct of a wolf that senses the trap closing, that the old man had not ridden south to admire the view. He had ridden to sell them. Clara lay beside him on the bed of dried grass in the sacristy. In the dim light, she looked peaceful, her hand curled under her cheek, the bandage on her arm a stark white against the gloom. Taza looked at her, searing the image into his mind. The curve of her jaw, the scatter of freckles across her nose, the rise and fall of her breath. He was memorizing her. He stood silently and moved to the gap in the adobe wall that served as a window. He scanned the ridge. Nothing moved. The desert willow stood motionless. The cactus wren was silent. That was the signal. The silence. "Clara," he said, his voice low but sharp. She woke instantly, the fear that had become her constant companion snapping her eyes open. "Taza?" "They are here." He did not wait for her to ask questions. He grabbed his ammunition belt and the water skin. "Run to the horses. Do not stop to saddle. Ride bareback. Go north, to the rocks." "What about you?" she asked, scrambling to her feet, her skirts rustling loudly in the quiet. "I will hold the door." "No!" She grabbed his arm. "Together! We run together!" Before he could argue, the morning shattered. A bugle call, shrill and terrifying, cut through the air. From the ridgeline, a volley of rifle fire erupted. Bullets slammed into the adobe walls. kicking up plumes of red dust and sending shards of clay flying like shrapnel. "Down!" Taza roared, tackling Clara to the dirt floor. Chunks of the ceiling rained down on them. Through the ringing in his ears, Taza heard the thunder of hooves. They were not approaching with caution. They were charging. The cavalry had come not to negotiate, but to overwhelm. "Come!" Taza dragged Clara up, crouching low. They bolted from the sacristy into the courtyard. The scene was chaotic. Blue-coated riders were pouring over the crumbled walls, their sabers flashing in the low light. The air was filled with the screams of horses and the crack of carbines. Taza raised his Winchester and fired from the hip. A soldier on a bay mare spun in his saddle and fell. Taza worked the lever action with a fluid, deadly grace. Crack! Another rider swerved. Clutching his shoulder, "The bell tower!" Taza shouted, shoving Clara toward the only structure that still had 4 walls. They scrambled up the rotting wooden stairs of the tower. Taza kicked the trapdoor shut behind them, but the wood was old and splintered. It would not hold for long. They were trapped. Through the narrow archways of the tower, they could see the courtyard filled with men. There were at least 30 of them. Dust swirled in a choking cloud. "Surrender!" a voice boomed from below. "Throw down your weapons! Taza, there is nowhere to go!" Taza looked at Clara. Her face was streaked with dust, her eyes wide with terror, but she was not crying. She gripped her hands together, her knuckles white. "I have 5 rounds," Taza said calmly. "I can take 5 of them." "And then," Clara whispered, "then I use the knife." "Taza, no," she grabbed his wrist. "If you fight, they will kill you. Look at them. There are too many. If I surrender, they hang me. If we surrender, we might live long enough to run again," she implored, her voice cracking. "Please, do not die here. Not today." The trapdoor shuddered as a rifle butt slammed into it from below. Wood splintered. Taza looked at the door, then at Clara. The fire in his blood demanded he go out fighting, that he take as many of the blue coats with him as he could to the spirit land. But the look in Clara's eyes stopped him. It was not just fear for herself. It was a plea for his life. He lowered the rifle. "I will not die today," he promised her. He dropped the Winchester. He unbuckled his knife belt and let it fall to the floor with a heavy clatter. "We are coming out," he shouted in English. "Do not shoot." The banging stopped. A moment later, the trap door was thrown open. Rough hands grabbed Taza's ankles and dragged him down the stairs. He did not resist, though every instinct screamed at him to strike. They hauled him into the courtyard and threw him into the dirt. A boot slammed into his ribs, knocking the wind out of him. Before he could draw a breath, 3 soldiers were on him, pinning his arms, binding his wrists with raw leather thongs so tight they cut into the skin. Clara was brought down behind him. She was not thrown, but she was gripped hard by 2 soldiers who held her arms like a vice. "Well, well," a voice drawled. A man on a large black stallion walked his horse forward. He wore the insignia of a captain. His mustache was waxed, his uniform immaculate despite the dust. He looked down at Taza with a mixture of curiosity and disgust. "The great Taza," the captain said. "Caught in a church. There is a joke in there somewhere." He looked up at Clara. "And Miss Vance, your uncle has been very worried, though I suspect he will be less worried when he sees the company you have been keeping." "He saved my life," Clara shouted, struggling against the soldiers. "He is not a criminal. He saved me from the desert." The captain dismounted slowly. He walked over to Clara, taking off his gauntlets. He reached out and tilted her chin up. Clara jerked her head away. "Saved you?" The captain laughed. A cold, dry sound. "My dear, look at you. You are in rags. You are sunburnt. You are consorting with a renegade who has killed more white men than smallpox. You haven't been saved. You've been spoiled." Taza growled low in his throat and surged upward, despite the men holding him. The captain turned and kicked Taza squarely in the face. Taza's head snapped back. Blood sprayed from his mouth. He collapsed, seeing stars. "Chain him to the wagon," the captain ordered, "and gag him." I am tired of hearing the savage growl." He turned back to Clara. "As for you, Miss Vance, we are taking you back to Prescott. Mr. Thorne is waiting. He seems to think a wedding can still salvage your reputation, though, personally, I think a hanging for treason would be more fitting for a woman who sleeps with the enemy." Clara stared at him with hatred burning in her gut. "I would rather hang than marry Elias Thorne." The captain smiled, thin and cruel. "You might get your wish." The journey back was a slow descent into hell. They separated them. Taza was chained to the back of a supply wagon, forced to walk in the dust and the heat. His hands were bound behind his back, and a heavy iron chain connected his neck to the wagon axle. If he slowed down, the chain choked him. If he fell, he would be dragged. He did not fall. He walked with his head high, ignoring the jeers of the soldiers, ignoring the thirst that turned his throat to sandpaper. His face was swollen from the captain's boot. One eye nearly shut, but the open eye burned with a cold, terrifying intelligence. He was not defeated. He was waiting. Clara was placed in a separate wagon, guarded by a young lieutenant named Grady. Grady was a man with soft hands and eyes that lingered too long on the tear in her dress. "You know," Grady said conversationally as the wagon jolted over the rocky trail, "people are saying you went with him willingly, that you turned squaw." Clara sat rigid, her back straight. She looked at the horizon, refusing to acknowledge him. "It's a shame," Grady continued, leaning closer. "A pretty thing like you, ruined. Thorne is a hard man. He won't take kindly to used goods. Maybe you could use a friend. Someone to put in a good word for you before we get to town." Clara turned slowly to look at him. "I have a friend," she said coldly. "He is walking behind this wagon in chains, and he is twice the man you are." Grady's face reddened. He reached out and grabbed her wrist, twisting it painfully. "You watch your mouth, traitor, or I'll have you gagged like your buck." They camped that night on a flat expanse of hardpan. The soldiers built fires and passed around bottles of whiskey, celebrating the capture of the elusive Taza. Taza was chained to a heavy ironwood post at the edge of the firelight. He had not been given water. He had not been given food. A shadow fell over him. He looked up. It was one of the scouts the army employed. Not a white man, but a half-blood. He wore a blue coat, but his hair was long, and he wore moccasins. Taza recognized him. It was Tom Littlebear. Years ago, before the wars turned bitter, Taza had taught the boy how to string a bow. Tom stood looking down at Taza. He held a ladle of water. He looked around nervously to ensure the soldiers were distracted by their gambling. "Drink," Tom whispered, holding the ladle to Taza's cracked lips. Taza turned his head away. "Do not be a fool," Tom hissed. "You will die of thirst." "I will not drink from the hand of a dog who wears the collar of the enemy," Taza rasped, his voice like grinding stones. Tom flinched. He lowered the ladle. "I have a family. Taza, I have to eat. The army pays. The army pays in blood," Taza said. He looked at the boy, no, the man, with pity. "Do you remember who you are, Littlebear, or have you forgotten the mountains?" Tom looked at the ground. He looked at the soldiers laughing by the fire, then back at the chained chief who had once been a legend to him. The shame was a visible thing. Hunching his shoulders. "They are going to hang you in Prescott," Tom whispered. "They want to make a show of it." "Let them," Taza said. "My spirit is already free." Tom stood there for a long moment. Then, with a shaking hand, he reached into his boot. He pulled out a small, sharp knife. He did not cut the bonds. That would be too obvious. Instead, he dropped the knife into the dust behind the post, kicking a pile of dirt over it with his moccasin. "I remember the mountains," Tom whispered. He turned and walked away, disappearing into the darkness. Taza waited. He waited until the moon was high and the soldiers' laughter had turned to snoring. He shifted his body, his fingers scrabbling in the dirt behind his back. Cold steel. He gripped the handle. It was awkward, painful work. He had to saw at the raw leather thongs binding his wrists, cutting his own skin in the process. The pain was sharp and focusing. Snap. His hands were free. He kept them behind his back, feigning captivity. He worked on the chain at his neck. The lock was simple, but he had no key. However, the post he was chained to was driven into dry, sandy earth. He began to dig. Clara was not sleeping. She was sitting in the back of the covered wagon, her hands tied loosely in front of her. Lieutenant Grady was sleeping on a bedroll near the tailgate, blocking her exit. She needed a weapon. She had been searched, but men were foolish. They looked for knives and guns. They did not look at a woman's hair. She reached up, her fingers trembling, and found the heavy iron pin holding her messy bun together. It was 4 inches long, sharp at the tip, a simple vanity. Now a shiv. She gripped it in her hand, hiding it in the folds of her skirt. She moved. The floorboards creaked. Grady stirred. He sat up, blinking in the gloom. "What are you doing? Sit down." "I need water," Clara said. "Please." Grady sighed, annoyed. He crawled toward her, a canteen in his hand. He stopped inches from her, his alcohol-sour breath washing over her face. He looked at her, and the cruel smirk returned. "You know," he murmured, reaching out to touch her cheek, "maybe you and I should have that talk now, about being friends." He leaned in, his intention clear. He was going to take what he wanted, knowing she was a prisoner with no rights. Clara did not flinch. She waited until he was close, until his hand was on her shoulder. Then she struck. She drove the hairpin down with all the force of her desperation. It sank into the meat of his shoulder, just above the collarbone. Grady screamed, a high, shocked sound. He reeled back, clutching his shoulder. Clara didn't wait. She scrambled over him, kicking him in the face as he tried to grab her ankle. She threw herself out the back of the wagon. The camp was waking up. Grady's scream had alerted the sentries. "She's escaping!" someone shouted. Clara ran. She didn't know where Taza was. She only knew she had to create chaos. She saw the picket line where the horses were tied. She pulled the knife she had stolen from the mess kit earlier that day, a small paring knife she had hidden in her boot, and slashed the tether rope of the nearest horse. It was the captain's black stallion. She grabbed the mane and swung herself up. The horse, spooked by the smell of her fear and the shouting men, reared. "Fire!" the captain shouted, emerging from his tent in his long johns. "Shoot her!" A gun cracked. A bullet whizzed past her ear. The stallion bolted. Clara clung to his neck, riding blindly into the night. She didn't steer him. She just let him run, putting distance between herself and the hell of the camp. Behind her, she heard more shots. Then a different sound, a guttural war cry that froze the blood in the veins of every soldier who heard it. Taza was free. She rode until the horse was foaming, guiding him by the mane, pressing her knees into his flanks. She did not go to Prescott. She did not go to the settlements. She rode east, toward the rising sun, toward the deep desert where the red rocks rose like broken teeth. She rode to the dry creek bed, the place where she had fallen, the place where he had found her. It took 2 days, 2 days of hiding in arroyos during the day, riding under the cover of stars. She had no water. She sucked on pebbles to keep the spit in her mouth. Her lips cracked and bled. The wound on her arm throbbed with a dull, sickening rhythm. When she finally reached the canyon, she slid off the horse and collapsed. The stallion wandered off to find scrub grass. Clara crawled into the shade of the mesquite bush, the same bush Taza had crouched behind weeks ago. She curled into a ball, clutching the hairpin that was still stained with Grady's blood. "Taza," she whispered to the dust. "Taza." She waited. The sun beat down. The vultures circled. She drifted in and out of consciousness, her mind playing tricks on her. She saw her father. She saw Elias Thorne. She saw the captain. Then she saw a shadow. It was long and distorted by the setting sun. It fell over her face, cooling the burning skin. She forced her eyes open. He was there. He looked like a revenant rising from the grave. His clothes were shredded. His chest was covered in dried blood and fresh bruises. One eye was swollen shut, purple and grotesque. He was limping heavily, favoring his left leg. He had no rifle, only a knife at his belt and the exhaustion of a man who has outrun death itself. "Clara," he croaked. She tried to sit up, but her strength failed her. Taza dropped to his knees beside her. He didn't care about the pain in his leg. He gathered her into his arms, pulling her against his battered chest. "You are here," he wept, his voice breaking. "You are here." Clara clung to him, her fingers digging into his bruised back. She buried her face in his neck, smelling the sweat and the blood and the iron scent of survival. "I escaped," she sobbed. "I heard him. I ran. I know," Taza whispered, rocking her. "I saw. You flew like a hawk." He pulled back to look at her. He touched her face with trembling fingers, tracing her lips, her eyelids, as if checking for cracks in a porcelain cup. "They hurt you," she said, touching the swollen eye. "It is nothing," he said. "Flesh heals." He kissed her. It was not the gentle kiss of the cave, nor the defiant kiss of the Apache camp. This was a kiss of desperation. It was salty with tears and blood. It was urgent, frantic. They moved together in the dust, fumbling with clothes, needing the friction of skin to prove they were still alive. They made love with a raw, terrifying intensity. There was no rhythm to it, only a chaotic collision of bodies seeking shelter in one another. Clara cried out, not in pleasure, but in relief so profound it hurt. Taza buried his face in her hair, his shoulders shaking with silent sobs. The fear of loss, the terror of the last few days, poured out of them. Every touch was a prayer. "I am here. I am not gone. You are real." When the storm passed, they lay tangled together in the dirt, the first stars appearing above the canyon rim. The air was cooling, but they did not reach for their clothes. Taza lay on his back, staring up at the vast, indifferent universe. Clara lay with her head on his chest, listening to the steady, ragged beat of his heart. "I saw Tom Littlebear," Taza said quietly into the silence. "He gave me the knife. He let me go." "He remembered you," Clara said. "He remembered who I was," Taza corrected. "But I am not that man anymore." He held up his hand, looking at the silhouette of his fingers against the stars. "The Apache called me traitor because I brought you to the mountains. The white men call me savage because I defend my life. I have no people. Clara." "The fire is out. The songs are gone." The desolation in his voice was absolute. He was a chief without a tribe, a warrior without a war. Clara pushed herself up. She looked down at him. Her hair was wild. Her dress was rags. Her skin was burned. But her eyes were clear and fierce. "Look at me," she said. He looked at her. "You are not a chief of the Bedonkohe anymore," she said. "And I am not the daughter of Amos Vance. We are ghosts to them. Let us be ghosts." She placed her hand over his heart, just as she had that first morning. "We do not need their tribes," she whispered. "We do not need their towns. We have this. We have the canyon. We have the blood in our veins." She leaned down and kissed his battered brow. "We will build our own tribe, Taza, a tribe of two. And if the world wants to come for us, let them come. We will be the storm that breaks them." Taza looked at her, and for the first time in days, a flicker of peace settled in his dark eyes. He reached up and covered her hand with his own. "A tribe of two," he repeated. "Yes, that is a good number." He sat up, wincing, and looked toward the north, toward the high, impenetrable peaks where the snow never melted and the trails were known only to the eagles. "We go high," he said, "where the air is thin, where they cannot breathe." Clara nodded. "We go high." They stood up together, two broken things welded into something unbreakable, and began the long walk into the dark. The trail ended where the air grew too thin for hatred to breathe. They had climbed for a week, pushing Taza's stolen paint stallion and Clara's weary legs until they reached a place the maps did not know. It was a high basin, cradled by granite peaks that stayed snow-capped even in August. In the center of this bowl of stone lay a lake, deep and still, its surface a perfect mirror of the sky. The water was so cold it numbed the fingers instantly, and the color was a startling impossible turquoise. "Here," Taza said, sliding off the horse. He patted the animal's sweating neck. "Here we stop." Clara looked around. There were no roads, no telegraph wires, no distant plumes of smoke from army forts. There was only the wind sighing through the Douglas firs and the cry of a golden eagle circling the thermals. It was a terrifying emptiness, but to Clara, it looked like a cathedral. They built their life with the frantic energy of castaways. Taza found a natural refuge against a cliff face, a shallow cave that they extended outward with felled logs and mud chinking. It was not the fine house Clara had once imagined in her girlhood daydreams, nor was it a traditional wickiup. It was something new, a hybrid of settler ingenuity and Apache pragmatism. The first winter was a brutal test. The snow fell in sheets, burying their small cabin until they had to tunnel out to reach the woodpile. They lived on dried venison and the pine nuts Taza had harvested in the autumn. The cold was a physical weight, pressing against the door, trying to find a crack in their armor. But inside, the fire burned. Clara kept a journal. She wrote on the backs of old wanted posters Taza had stolen during their flight. And later, on birch bark when the paper ran out. She made ink from charcoal and water, using a sharpened turkey quill. December 21st, 1880. She wrote, "The sun has not touched the valley floor in 3 days. The wind sounds like a woman screaming, but Taza is here. He is mending his moccasins by the fire. He looks at me, and the winter goes away. We are hungry, but we are free." Taza taught her the world. He did not teach her the names of presidents or the capitals of states. He taught her the language of the land. They walked through the high meadows when the snow melted. Taza would stop, pointing to a small, purple flower. "Eyes," he said. "Medicine. Good for my stomach." He pointed to a red-tailed hawk screaming above them. "Senishu. He sees everything. We must be like him." He taught her to walk without breaking twigs, to smell the rain before it crested the peaks, to read the scat of the black bear and the mountain lion. And, in return, Clara gave him the one thing he had lost. She gave him a future. She read to him from the small Bible she had carried in her pocket, not for religion, but for stories of endurance. She told him about the ocean, which she had only read about, describing waves as tall as trees. Taza would listen, his dark eyes fixed on her face, drinking in her voice like water in the desert, the anger that had defined him. The sharp, jagged edges of the warrior began to smooth out like a river stone. In the spring of their second year, the child came. Clara knew the fear of it. It was the ghost of her father's voice, whispering that she was dead, that childbirth was a curse. As her belly swelled, the old terror returned, waking her in the night with gasping sobs. Taza would hold her, his large hands resting on the life growing inside her. "The ghost is a liar," he would rumble against her hair. "You are strong. You are the earth." When the labor began, it was a stormy night. The wind battered the cabin, shaking the roof beams. Taza did not leave her side. He had seen horses foal. He had seen women in the tribe give birth. But this was different. This was his heart fighting to bring more life into the world. Clara fought for 14 hours. The pain was a white-hot iron, tearing her apart. At the height of it, she screamed that she could not do it, that the darkness was taking her. Taza gripped her hands, anchoring her to the world. "Look at me," he commanded, his voice cutting through her panic. "You are here. Stay here." And then, a cry, sharp, indignant, and alive. Taza caught the child. He wrapped the slippery, squalling infant in a soft, doe-skin blanket he had cured himself. He looked at the baby, then at Clara, tears streaming down his scarred face. "A girl," he whispered. "A daughter." Clara reached for her. She was small, with a tuft of black hair and skin that was a perfect blend of cream and copper. When she opened her eyes, they were Taza's eyes, dark, bottomless, and fierce. But when she cried, the sound was Clara's voice, clear and demanding. They named her Nita. It meant nothing in English, and nothing specific in Apache. It was a name they made up, a sound that belonged only to her. Years moved like the seasons, fast and unforgiving, yet beautiful. Nita grew. She was a creature of the mountains, wild as a fawn. She wore buckskin dresses Clara sewed and ran barefoot over the granite rocks. She spoke a language that was a mix of Apache, English, and words she invented herself. She knew how to track a rabbit before she knew her alphabet. They were happy. It was a hard happiness, earned with blistered hands and aching backs, but it was real. But the world below the mountains had not forgotten them. It was late autumn, 5 years after they had arrived. The aspens were turning gold, shaking their coins in the wind. Taza was splitting wood behind the cabin, the rhythmic thwack of the axe echoing off the cliffs. Clara was by the lake, washing clothes in the icy water. Nita was playing near the tree line, building a house for a beetle. The dogs, 2 wolf hybrids Taza had raised, started barking. It was not the bark of greeting. It was the bark of war. Taza dropped the axe. He grabbed his Winchester from where it leaned against the stump. Clara stood up, her hands wet and cold. She looked toward the pass, the only way in. 3 riders were emerging from the timber. They were not soldiers. Soldiers rode in formation, wore uniforms. These men wore dusters and battered hats. Their horses were weary, and their gear clattered with the sound of heavy weaponry. Bounty hunters. They stopped 20 yards from the cabin. The lead man was big, with a beard that looked like a bird's nest and a face pockmarked by bad living. He held a heavy Sharps rifle across his saddle. "Well now," the big man shouted, his voice scratching against the silence. "Looks like the rumors were true. Old One-Eye Jack said there was a ghost in the high country." Taza stepped forward, placing himself between the riders and the path to the lake where Clara and Nita were. He held the rifle loose, but ready. "This is not your land," he said, his English rusty but clear. "Turn around." The big man laughed. "Not my land. Son, this is United States territory, and you look like United States property, specifically the property of the hanging judge in Prescott. There is $1,000 on your head. Taza, dead or alive." The other 2 men fanned out, hands hovering near their holsters. "We do not want trouble," Taza said, "but we will not go. You don't have a choice, Injun," one of the other men sneered. "We tracked you for 3 weeks. We ain't leaving empty-handed." The big man cocked his rifle. "Drop the gun. Taza, or I will put a hole in you and drag you down the mountain." Taza did not move. He calculated the odds. 3 men. He could take the leader, maybe the second one, but the third would kill him. And then they would find Clara. They would find Nita. "I said drop it," the big man roared. Crack! A gunshot rang out, sharp and sudden. It did not come from Taza. It came from the lake. The big man's hat flew off his head. A neat hole punched through the crown. The riders' horses danced, panicked. The men spun around. Clara stood by the corner of the cabin. She held an old Walker Colt revolver, a heavy, rusted cannon of a gun that Taza had taught her to use. She held it with 2 hands, her feet planted wide, her face a mask of cold fury. "The next one goes through your eye," she shouted. Her voice did not tremble. It was the voice of a woman who had survived the desert, the fever, and the silence. "Get off my land." The bounty hunters stared at her. They looked at the white woman in buckskins, her hair wild, holding a gun like a soldier. "Now, miss," the big man stammered, reaching for his hat on the ground. "We didn't know." "You know now," Clara said. She cocked the hammer again. "Ride or die. I do not care which." Taza stepped up beside her, his rifle raised. "You heard my wife." The 3 men looked at Taza, then at Clara, then at the dark woods where the wolf dogs were snarling. They saw something in the eyes of this couple, something more dangerous than $1,000. They saw a ferocity that had nothing to lose. "Crazy," the big man muttered. "The whole damn family is crazy." He yanked his reins, turning his horse. "We're going. Keep your rock pile." They rode away fast, looking back over their shoulders until they disappeared into the trees. Clara did not lower the gun until the sound of hooves faded completely. Then her knees buckled. Taza caught her. He pulled the heavy pistol from her hand and wrapped his arms around her. She was shaking now, the adrenaline crashing. "You missed," Taza whispered, a smile in his voice. "I aimed for his head," Clara said breathlessly. "Remind me never to make you angry." Taza said. He kissed her forehead. "You are a warrior. Clara Vance." "I'm Clara Taza," she corrected him, but the peace was broken. They knew the men would talk. Others would come. The sanctuary had been breached. That night, they sat by the fire, Nita asleep in her furs. They cleaned their weapons in silence. "We must move," Taza said heavily. "Higher, into the rocks." "There is nowhere higher." "Taza," Clara said. "We are at the top of the world." "Then we fight," he said. "There are too many of them." The dogs barked again. Taza stood up instantly, blowing out the lantern. "Stay here." He went to the door, opening it a crack. Shadows were emerging from the tree line again. But these were not men on horses. They were walkers, ghosts moving through the moonlight. There were 10 of them. They carried rifles, but the weapons were slung over their shoulders, not held in hands. They wore the high moccasins of the Apache. Taza stepped out onto the porch. "Who comes?" he called in his own tongue. A figure stepped forward. It was a woman, bent with age, leaning on a staff of twisted ironwood. "Nali?" Taza whispered. It seemed impossible. She was ancient when he left. She should have been dead years ago. Yet here she stood, her white hair shining like a halo in the moon. Behind her stood Chaitin, the man who had once threatened to kill Taza, and several other elders of the band. Taza walked down the steps, stunned. "How did you find us?" "The white men talk loudly in the canyons," Nali said, her voice like grinding gravel. "We saw 3 riders leaving in a hurry." "They said a demon woman shot at them." She cackled. "I knew it was her." Taza looked at the warriors behind her. They did not look angry. They looked tired. Their faces were lined with the years of running, of being hunted, of watching their world shrink. "Why are you here?" Taza asked. "Guarding the door." Chaitin stepped forward. He looked older, his scar white against his dark skin. He looked at the cabin, then at Taza. "The soldiers are everywhere," Chaitin said quietly. "Geronimo has surrendered. The wars are ending. Taza, we are being moved to Florida, to a prison in the swamps." Taza felt a cold stone in his gut. "All of you?" "Most," Chaitin said. "But the army, they are tired of chasing ghosts. They asked about you. The general said if Taza is gone, if Taza stays gone, they will not send men to these high peaks. The rocks are of no use to them." "We came to tell you," Nali said, walking closer. She reached out and touched Taza's arm. "You fought for us, grandson. You killed the scout to save your secret. We saw that. We judged you wrong." "We made a deal," Chaitin said, his voice thick with difficulty. "We told the Bluecoats that Taza is dead, that he died in the winter storms 5 years ago. We showed them a grave." Taza stared at them. "You lied to me? You are dead to the world." "Taza," Nali said, "and because you are dead, you can live." She looked past him, to the door where Clara was standing, holding Nita. Nali's eyes softened. She walked past Taza, up the steps. Clara stiffened, but Nali reached out and touched Nita's cheek. "She has the eyes of the people," Nali whispered, "and the spirit of the mother." She turned back to Taza. "We will go to the wagons tomorrow. We go to the swamps, but one fire remains in the mountains. Keep it burning, Taza, keep it burning for us." They did not stay. It was too dangerous. They touched hands, shared a drink of water, and then the ghosts of the Bedonkohe faded back into the forest, marching toward their surrender so that Taza and his family could remain free. Taza watched them go until the night swallowed them whole. He felt a grief, vast and hollow, but beneath it, a foundation of rock. He was an exile, but he was free. The final night came many years later, or perhaps it was only a moment. Time moves differently when you are the only 2 people on Earth. They sat by the edge of the lake. The water was black glass, reflecting the full moon that hung heavy and orange over the peaks. The air was crisp. smelling of pine resin and the coming winter. Clara leaned her head on Taza's shoulder. Her hair was streaked with gray now, silver threads amidst the brown. Taza's face was a roadmap of lines, worn by the sun and the wind. They watched the reflection of the moon bob gently in the water. "Do you remember the cave?" Clara asked softly. "The storm?" Taza took her hand. His grip was still strong, still warm. "I remember the cold, and then the heat." He looked at her, turning her hand over to trace the lines of her palm. "I was a stone then, Clara, a dead thing walking. I thought the world was only a pain. I thought love was a weakness that got people killed." He looked out at the water. "That first night," he whispered, his voice rough with emotion. "I lost everything I was. I lost my rank. I lost my tribe. I lost my hatred." He turned to look at her, his dark eyes shining in the moonlight. "And I found everything I am." Clara smiled, tears glistening in her eyes. "And what are you, Taza?" "I am the man who loves you," he said. "That is enough. That is everything." They sat in silence as the moon climbed higher. Two souls who had outrun the cavalry, the bounty hunters, the prejudices, and the history of a bleeding nation. They had carved a sanctuary out of the rock with nothing but their hands and their will. As the night turned to gray, and the gray turned to the rose gold of dawn, a sound broke the stillness. It was laughter. Nita ran from the cabin, her black hair flying behind her. She was older now, strong and lithe. She did not fear the cold. She ran straight into the icy water of the lake, splashing and shrieking with joy. She danced in the shallows, kicking up sprays of diamonds that caught the rising sun. She was neither white nor Apache. She was in the morning. She was the future. Taza and Clara watched her. They watched the proof of their victory. The world had tried to bury them. It had tried to shoot them, hang them, starve them, and separate them. It had passed laws to keep them apart. It had sent armies to destroy them. But the world had failed, because down by the water, in the light of a new day, their daughter was laughing. And she was free. Thank you for listening to the story of Taza and Clara. It has been a journey through the dust and the heartache of the American West, and I hope their fight for love resonated with you. I would love to know where you are listening from. Please leave a comment below sharing your city or country. If you enjoyed this tale, I encourage you to subscribe to From Wild West for more stories of the frontier. Please share your thoughts on the ending in English. I read everyone. Until we ride again.